Thomas Pitera entered the world far from the headlines that would one day frame his name in bold. Born on December 2, 1954, in Brooklyn, New York, he grew up in the Gravesend section, a neighborhood of modest row houses, corner candy stores, and social clubs where older men watched the street like it was a television with endless reruns. His father, Joseph, an Italian-American from the Campagna area of Salerno, hauled candy and snacks as an independent concession salesman. His mother, Catherine, was of German and Polish stock, a mix that made their son a second-generation American, but tethered him to multiple old worlds at once. At David A. Boody Junior High on Avenue S, Tommy was not remembered as a tough kid, or even a particularly notable one. Teachers later recalled him, if at all, as a daydreamer who seemed half removed from the classroom. And the kids who did notice him tended to do it for the wrong reasons. He had a high-pitched voice that invited mockery, a quiet manner that made him an easy target, and for a while the only thing he learned in the schoolyard was how it felt to be pushed around. According to later accounts, he wanted badly to make the baseball team, to belong in the most normal way a Brooklyn teenager could, but ostracism on and off the field hardened into resentment. In what would read later like the first small crime of a much darker ledger, he broke into the school after hours, stole the varsity team's equipment, and fenced it around the neighborhood. A petty burglary that earned him a juvenile conviction, but also showed him how quickly rules could be broken, how property could change hands in the shadows if a boy was willing to cross a line. The transformation that followed did not start in a pool room or a backroom bar, but in front of a television. In 1966, like so many kids of his generation, he watched The Green Hornet and locked on to Bruce Lee, the lightning-fast martial artist whose movement made bullies look slow and clumsy. The show, and later the film Marlowe, cracked open a world for him. Asian fighting styles, Eastern philosophy, an idea of discipline that promised power to someone who had spent his childhood on the receiving end of taunts. Pitera grew his hair longer than his parents liked, began eating sushi in a neighborhood where that was still exotic, and, in Sheepshed Bay, joined a local dojo. There he found something that finally fit: the repetitive strikes, the long holds, the painful stretching. He immersed himself completely, lifting weights, reading manuals on Kyokushin and other hard-style disciplines, watching grainy kung fu movies over and over until the moves became part of his imagination. The weak, bullied kid from Avenue S began to disappear, replaced by a young man who could absorb blows and return them with cold precision. Winning a local kumite competition opened the next door. Through a scholarship arrangement that blended dojo sponsorship and his own determination, he made it to Tokyo, spending more than 2 years in Japan, training under Shihan-level instructors in traditional ninjutsu rather than formal karate. Far from Brooklyn's brick and asphalt, he walked crowded Tokyo streets with a GI folded under his arm, learning how to move silently and strike decisively. He practiced with weapons that few neighborhood toughs back home had ever held: tonfa, nunchaku, blades that required exact control. Family members who visited him later said they were stunned at the difference. The skinny boy with the uncertain posture had been replaced by a wiry athlete who carried himself like a man who knew exactly what his body could do. He had grown his hair down to his shoulders to mirror Bruce Lee's image, and learned enough Japanese custom to pass politely in the streets. What he did not leave behind, however, was the sense that his life needed to be more than a job and an apartment. A darker ambition was taking shape, one that would fuse physical skill with the brutal economy of the New York underworld. When his scholarship money ran out, he worked briefly in a chopsticks factory to stay in Japan a little longer, an odd, almost mundane prelude to the life that waited in Brooklyn. But eventually, the pull of home and the limitations of factory wages drew him back to Gravesend, where the landscape had changed in ways that mattered. On the streets and in social clubs, a Bonanno family faction around Alphonse Sonny Red, Indelicato and other dissatisfied capos simmered against the official leadership of boss Philip Rastelli and his favoured captains, Joseph Massino and Dominic Sonny Black Napolitano. For a returning martial artist looking to prove himself, it was a violent opportunity. Pitera gravitated into Sonny Red's orbit, where his combination of discipline and quiet intensity stood out. There were plenty of tough men in those rooms, but almost none who had been trained abroad in hand-to-hand combat, who read books on warfare and anatomy, who could move with the coiled stillness of a fighter waiting for a bell. The world he stepped into had been shaped, in part, by the violence of an earlier generation. Years before Tommy's star began to rise, Carmine Galante's heroin rampage and eventual assassination in Bushwick had shaken the entire Mafia structure. The same hit that so many mob watchers would later fix on, the brazen midday shotgun murder of Galante in the garden of Joe and Mary's restaurant, became a formative memory for the young karate enthusiast. One of the shooters who strode through the restaurant that day, ski mask pulled down and shotgun held low, was Bruno Whack Whack Indelicato, Sonny Red's son. His participation in the commission-sanctioned hit on Galante made him a hero in La Cosa Nostra circles, proof that he was willing to walk into a crowded yard of civilians and turn a powerful boss into a corpse for the good of the organization. To Tommy Pitera, Bruno was something more personal. A mentor and a pathfinder, the living evidence that violence applied in the right direction could elevate a man from screw-up overnight. Later that same afternoon, when Bruno walked into the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy and was greeted with hugs and kisses by both Bonanno and Gambino soldiers, FBI cameras recorded the moment. But in the imagination of a young associate like Pitera, what mattered was the message. In this world, murder done correctly was a passport to respect. The Bonanno civil war that followed Galante's death pushed everyone to pick a side. Sonny Red and his fellow three capos wanted to seize control from Rastelli's loyalists. Rastelli, from a federal detention center, leaned on Massino and Sonny Black to fight back. Negotiations failed, and one spring night in 1981, the Gambino-aligned faction lured Sonny Red, Dominic Trinchera, and Philip Giacone to a meeting in a Brooklyn club partly owned by Sammy Gravano, and cut them down in a fusillade of gunfire. The murders, unprecedented in that three captains were executed together, decapitated the faction that had nurtured Pitera. In the aftermath, Sonny Red's son Bruno became a target as well, the young killer suddenly marked for death by the same organization that had celebrated him. When he heard that his father had been found buried in a lot near Ruby Street, still wearing a $5,000 Cartier watch, Bruno understood how small one man's reputation really was when set against the survival instincts of a mafia family. The reaction was instantaneous and instructive. Bruno did not swagger into the street looking for revenge, he ran. Alongside him, providing guns and loyalty, was Tommy Pitera. The two men fled Brooklyn and holed up in a secluded house on the edge of Long Island, where Tommy brought an army duffel bag packed with weapons and spent long hours cleaning and oiling them, methodically preparing for a last stand that in the end never came. Through intermediaries, a quiet message went back and forth between Bruno and Joseph Massino. If Bruno let go of his desire for vengeance and accepted the new order, he would be allowed to live and keep his crew. This was one of the first bitter lessons Pitera absorbed in full. Even when a man's father has been murdered, personal grief bends before the larger calculations of power. Bruno accepted the deal, came home, and continued operating. Tommy, who had risked his own life to stand by him, took note of who stayed in control and who ended up in the ground. Yet the alliance that had seemed so tight in the Long Island hideout soon frayed. Bruno, devastated by his father's murder and perhaps freed by the knowledge that he had been spared, sank deeper into cocaine. Trips to Miami became hazy marathons of drugs and girlfriends, and the sharp, disciplined edge a mafia life demanded dulled rapidly. Within that culture, occasional indulgence was tolerated, addiction was not. Pitera watched his friend deteriorate inside a cloud of numbness, and slowly, his respect evaporated. In a world where every man was only as good as his reliability in a crisis, Bruno's spiraling habit became a liability, and Tommy, who prized control above all, began to look elsewhere for an anchor. That anchor appeared in the form of Anthony Spiro, a Bath Avenue power broker whose public face was as a genial 4th of July showman running lavish free firework displays and neighborhood cookouts, and whose private identity was underboss of the Bonanno family. Spiro's combination of charm, political instincts, and readiness to sanction violence matched what Pitera was seeking. A leader who could move comfortably among ordinary Brooklynites in one moment and sit at a table with killers in the next. Spiro recognized the value in Pitera's discipline and cold focus, and in time, as the family stabilized after the war, he put forward the young assassin's name when the moment came to open the books. For Pitera, this was the culmination of every ambition he had formed since leaving Japan. The chance to become not just an associate earning on the side, but a sworn member of La Cosa Nostra. The making ceremony took place in a modest red brick house off Bath Avenue in Bensonhurst, a setting ordinary enough to reassure neighbours, but heavy with meaning on the inside. Consigliere Anthony Spiro presided, along with established captains like Frankie Curly Lino, a pudgy veteran mobster with tight curls and deep family ties to legendary killer Eddie Lino. The ritual was simple, as it had been when it crossed the Atlantic decades before. A saint's picture placed in the inductee's cupped hand, the paper pricked and set alight, the ancient Sicilian words of the oath, repeating that the family now came before wife, parents or children, and that betrayal would be punished by the same fire consuming the saint. Pitera, chest out, shoulders square, recited the pledge in his high, almost falsetto voice, an incongruous sound in the solemn room. If any man present felt an urge to smirk, he swallowed it. They understood what the man in front of them was capable of. When he finished, hands and cheeks were clasped in hushed congratulations, and later at Tommaso's restaurant on 86th Street, there were toasts. Not loud, celebratory roars, but quiet, murderous affirmations that a new killer had been formally added to their ranks. From that point forward, Tommy Pitera was no longer a stray blade. He was an instrument of the Bonanno crime family, and the line between his personal identity and his professional purpose vanished. Drugs became his main money engine, high-grade Sicilian heroin, South American cocaine, product that linked Brooklyn backrooms to international suppliers. For him, dealing was not just commerce, it was a barometer of respect. When he fronted cocaine to another man, give now, pay later, he saw it as staking his own reputation on the customer's word. Twice, a man named Thomas Salerno paid his debt late but made good, and twice Pitera tolerated it with a warning. The third time, when Salerno failed to pay altogether and dodged face-to-face explanations, the debt became something more than money. Pitera lured him into a car under the pretext of a talk, drove him near Gravesend Cemetery, and shot him dead, leaving the corpse in the vehicle within sight of the headstones. Detectives who found the body had no immediate link to Pitera, but on the street the story spread quickly. Tommy had killed a man simply for violating the agreement on drug payments. It was both a warning and an advertisement. If you did business with him, you had to take him seriously. Salerno's murder opened a grim chapter. Realizing that letting any drug debt slide would invite others to do the same, Pitera used killing as his collection agency. He eliminated not only customers who had stiffed him, but associates within his own circle when they became unreliable or sloppy. Word circulated that he had turned dismemberment into an almost clinical process, cutting bodies into 6 pieces and burying them in locations chosen with disturbing intelligence. It was said that he favored bird sanctuaries, knowing that environmental protections would make construction and digging there difficult, thereby shielding graves from being disturbed. There were whispered references to an autopsy table in a basement he controlled, a metal slab where he could apply his reading in anatomy and his training in precision cuts. In the half-world of Brooklyn's mob hangouts, all of this made him a terrifying figure. He often dressed in black, avoided daylight, and his pale skin above the dark clothes lent him an almost vampiric presence when he walked into a social club, and men instinctively shifted so they would not have their backs exposed. While he was expanding this personal empire of drugs and fear, federal law enforcement was escalating its own campaign. On the other side of the street, in anonymous Manhattan offices and in unmarked cars, DEA Group 33, led by agents like Jim Hunt and Tommy Geisel, watched the rise of men like Pitera with growing concern. The wider war on narcotics, fought against Colombians, Mexicans, Dominicans, and Sicilian traffickers, produced endless seizures and dramatic shootouts. But the river of product never seemed to slow. Within that chaos, a specialized case, later known as Pizza 2, began to coalesce. It involved Sicilian importers feeding heroin to American families through pizza parlors and catering halls. And one of the links between this international pipeline and Brooklyn's local underworld was a maitre d' named Vinnie DeMarco. DeMarco's son had been fronted a pound of heroin by a hard Sicilian dealer, Salvatore Canavo, and when the younger man was ripped off trying to resell it, the family debt ballooned to $75,000. Trying to save his son, Vinnie went to Canavo and offered to pay slowly, $2,000 a month. Canavo, cold as stone, shifted the obligation onto the father instead. What followed, Vinnie's reluctant cooperation with the DEA, the slow building of trust with Hunt and Geisel, would bring federal attention closer and closer to the Bonanno crews operating in Gravesend and Bensonhurst, including the quiet martial artist known as Tommy Karate. By the late 1980s, law enforcement believed that Pitera had crossed a line that even many hardened mafiosi shied away from. Traditional rules frowned on killing women. Pitera ignored that boundary. Testimony from Frank Ganji, a young associate who would later flip, painted a picture of a man for whom gender made no difference when he felt threatened or disrespected. Ganji described how, after Pitera's wife died of a drug overdose, he blamed a woman named Phyllis Birdie for providing the drugs, waited until she was asleep after a night of cocaine and sex, then shot her, and methodically cut her body into pieces in a bathroom, washing blood down a running tub as if cleaning a training mat. In another case, Ganji claimed a drug dealer named Marek Kucharski offended the Bonanno killer during an argument. Pitera responded by pulling a knife and stabbing him repeatedly. Whether every detail was accurate or not, the composite image that emerged in court filings and press accounts was of a man who not only killed, but seemed to find a kind of private ritual in dismembering the dead, combining his anatomical studies with a cold, almost scientific detachment. The case that finally brought him down was the culmination of years of surveillance, informant cultivation, and the patient tying together of missing persons whose last known interactions ran through the same quiet figure in black. In June 1990, federal agents moved in a sweeping operation that netted Pitera along with roughly 24 Bonanno associates connected to a sprawling drug ring distributing marijuana, cocaine, and heroin. For the agents who had watched him stride in and out of social clubs, where men subtly turned to face him, it was a moment of justified risk. They knew the stories about his martial arts skills and his reputation for carrying weapons. But the arrest went off without the cinematic fight some might have imagined. The real battle, they knew, would be in the courtroom, where they would have to persuade a jury not only that he had trafficked in narcotics, but that he had personally directed or carried out a chain of murders. That courtroom clash unfolded in 1992 before Judge Rena Raggi. Federal prosecutors led by David W. Shapiro argued that Thomas Pitera was not merely a mob soldier dabbling in drugs and violence, but a heinous, cruel, and depraved killer who had, in some instances, tortured victims before killing them, shooting one man slowly in multiple parts of the body before delivering a final fatal round. They asked for the ultimate penalty: death. Rarely in the modern history of New York mob cases had the government pushed so hard to execute a Mafia figure. But they believed his particular combination of premeditated brutality and body mutilation warranted it. Their star witness was Gangi, the same protégé who had accompanied Pitera on killings, and then, after a drunken driving arrest, sat in a holding cell, reliving the horrors until he asked to speak to a detective and began to talk. Jurors listened as Gangi recounted dismemberments in bathtubs, clandestine burials in Staten Island wetlands, and casual discussions of killing as if it was simple business. Defense attorneys hammered at his credibility, pointing out that his cooperation had secured him a 10-year sentence, despite his admitted participation in multiple murders. In the end, the jury split the difference between the competing narratives. On June 25, 1992, they convicted Pitera of 6 murders tied to his mob and drug activities, and found him guilty of running a large-scale narcotics operation. But when it came to sentencing, they stopped short of authorizing his execution. The decision shifted the final word to Judge Raggi, who, reviewing the evidence of dismembered victims and the testimony about his methods, sentenced him to life imprisonment. Summing up what she had seen in photographs and heard in weeks of testimony, she told him in open court, "Mr. Pitera, nobody deserves to die as these people died." For the families of the victims, the life sentence without parole meant they would never have to read about his release. For the DEA agents who had chased him across years of undercover work, it was a validation of their strategy. For Pitera himself, who smirked and gave a thumbs up to reporters after hearing that he had escaped the death chamber, it was a mixed outcome. He had avoided the needle, but he would spend the rest of his days behind bars. Today, Tommy Karate Pitera is an aging inmate in the federal system, serving his life sentence at a high-security penitentiary. Records list him at USP Big Sandy in Kentucky. His once-feared presence reduced to a mugshot in databases and the occasional true crime feature. Outside the prison fences, the neighborhoods that formed him have changed. Gravesend and Bath Avenue, once dotted with social clubs and backroom card games, are more gentrified, their old storefronts converted into cafes and boutiques. The parks and wildlife refuges where bodies were once buried, including Staten Island land that later searches tied to his crimes, are quieter now, their grassy surfaces hiding the forensic excavations that took place after informants described how the Bonanno killer used protected land as a morgue. Inside, the man who once trained obsessively in ninjutsu and read books on dismemberment is just another inmate moving through a regimented schedule he did not design. He may still stretch in his cell, still run through kata forms in his mind, but the only opponents he faces now are time and memory. Yet the story of Tommy Karate continues to ripple through both law enforcement culture and Mafia law. For agents like Jim Hunt, who later recalled how no one wanted their back to Tommy Pitera, his career stands as an example of what can happen when a man with highly honed physical skills and a deep capacity for detachment finds affirmation inside a criminal organization that rewards ruthlessness. For mob watchers and historians, he embodies a late-era mutation of the American Mafia, less involved in labor racketeering or traditional gambling, more tied to drugs and the ultra-violence that accompanied them in the 1970s and 1980s. And for the families of the dead, his name remains not a mythic title, but a reminder of irreplaceable loss. Sons, daughters, lovers, and parents who vanished into a system of debts, suspicions, and revenge, in which their lives were treated as expendable. The quiet kid from Avenue S, who couldn't make the baseball team, had finally found a place where fear and brutality could make him somebody. In the end, the same world that crowned him Tommy Karate made sure he would never walk its streets again.